Welcome everyone to our Learning from Ethiopia series. We're very happy that you're able to join us both on Zoom and on our Facebook Live. We're very happy that you can join us. And also thank you, Stefan, for taking part in this. I'm very much looking forward to your talk and very interested in this topic as this is the first time I'm hearing of it as well. And I'm sure it is the same for most people here. Next, I'd like to also welcome Harriet, the Executive Director at Intibau, and Binyam, the Chapter Chair of Intibau Ethiopia, along with Juliet, the Program Coordinator, who's helping and making sure this is organized and going smoothly. Thank you all very much. And now I'll pass it over to Binyam so that he could introduce Intibau as well as Stefan.
Yeah, thank you, Mina. Again, welcome everyone who's able to join us from wherever you are for our second talk of Learning from Ethiopia series. This is part of 5 months long open talk series that we are organizing, and with this talk that we seek to inspire and facilitate discussion in and around local building practices with the aim of learning to design and build a better future. The program lasts until the June. We will have 3 more lectures after this each month. And if you want to become a member and also follow our updates, Mina will be sharing the link to the registration to become a member on the chat, both on Zoom and Facebook, I hope. And you can also follow us for regular updates on different social medias. And regarding this lecture, if you have any questions as we go along, you can type it in the chat, and Mina will make sure to bring them forward to Stefan after the presentation. And now I would like to introduce our second speaker, Stefan, for joining us today. Thank you very much. As his background is quite extensive, I'm just gonna read it. Stephane Pradines, he's an archaeologist and a professor of Islamic art and architecture at the Aga Khan University Institute for the study of Muslim civilization in London. He was also the director of excavations of the walls of Cairo in Egypt and many other excavations in the Indian Oceans, Maldives, and East Africa, in countries like Kenya, Tanzania, and as well as Comoros. He is a specialist of Islamic archaeology in Sub-Saharan Africa, Indian Ocean, medieval trade, and Muslim material culture of war. He is also the founding editor of the Journal of Material Cultures in the Muslim World, an academic journal which is in full open access, published by Brill in partnership with the Aga Khan University and the Aga Khan Museum. And his last book in the press is titled Historic Mosques in Sub-Saharan Africa from Timbuktu to Zanzibar. And he mostly works on conservation projects, which include works with the Aga Khan Trust for Culture on conservation projects such as the walls of Cairo, and also in Kilwa and Kua. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right. Correct me if I'm wrong, Stefan. These are in Tanzania, of course, in collaboration with the UNESCO and the World Monuments Fund. And his today's talk would be focusing on archaeological work, which was carried out in Ethiopia back in 2008 and around Nora Mosque, and he would be focusing on this and in general Islamic architecture in the region. So over to you, Stefan.
Thank you very much, Binyam. So I think I will start to share my screen with you. So first of all, I would like to thank warmly my colleagues, Binyam Ailo, Minya Awol, and Juliette Butler for their kind invitation to participate to the talk series. Talking about mosque in Ethiopia seems maybe strange, as Ethiopia is known first for its antique and Christian monuments from Aksum to Lalibela. And a few people know about the Muslim past of Ethiopia, except maybe the holy city of Harare. But Harare belongs to modern history, and after the 16th century. And today we will look at Ethiopian medieval history, and in particular Muslim societies in Ethiopia. I would like to start by a short historiography on the topic. The Islamic history of Ethiopia is not unknown to several researchers, and a lot of scholars publish books on this topic, including Enrico Cerulli, study Ethiopici, La lingua e la storia di Arab in 1936, and John Trimingham, Islam in Ethiopia in 1952. We have also several studies about the Muslim city of Harare, but most of our knowledge was limited to the modern period, as I said, and post-16th century. Second point, our knowledge about Muslim cultures was dependent of historical and primary sources, especially sources written by non-Muslims, Europeans, and Christian Ethiopians. There was a need to collect new data about these medieval societies to know how they lived and interact with other Ethiopian cultures. It is a reason why Bertrand Hirsch, professor at Panthéon-Sorbonne and former director of the French Ethiopian Studies Center of Ethiopian Studies, it's the man that you can see to the left. He's not an Ethiopian priest, it's Bertrand Hirsch, a professor from the Sorbonne. And Bertrand Hirsch launched a research program on this topic. This time, archaeology was included as a main discipline to bring new data about Ethiopian past. Two medieval mosques were excavated by the archaeologist Bertrand Poissonnier and the historian Derese Agneshe in Gozé and Faki Dabis in the Ifat, and published in 2007. The research program continued later under the direction of François-Xavier Fauvel, now professor at the Collège de France in Paris and former director of the French Center of Ethiopian Studies in Addis Ababa. And in 2008, François-Xavier Fauvel, Bertrand Hirsch, and Derese Agneshe launched new excavations on the site of Nora. Following these researches, several projects started in Ethiopia and emerged since the past years. In 2014, Timothy Insol launched an excavation on the site of the old Mosque of Arla in the Harari regional state. But the most important and international project is called Horn East Connections, mobility and exchange between the Horn of Africa and the Middle East in the Middle Age. The project is directed by Professor Julien Loiseau and directly linked to the previous project that I mentioned, and including the Professor Bertrand Hirsch, Dr. Derese Agneshe, and Dr. Amélie Chekroun. As you can see on this map, especially the one to the right, I don't know if you can see my pointer, two trade routes were used for the penetration of Islam in the Horn of Africa, connecting the Ethiopian island to the sea. First, the ancient north-south axis or route from the 9th, 12th centuries from the Darlak archipelago or islands in the Red Sea via the eastern Tigray and the escarpment of the high central plateau, the eastern Shoa. This was probably at the origin of the emergence of the local Muslim powers described by the historian Al-Idrisi along the border and below the Christian land. Then the east-west axis or road from the end of the 9th century to the 16th century, connecting the Gulf of Aden with the highland of the Eastern Plateau and the lakes of the Rift Valley. You can see this road here. The chains of sites forming a route of penetration and trade may correspond to the Muslim kingdoms described by the historian Al-Umari at the beginning of the 14th century. This author relates the existence of 7 sultanates located in Ethiopia and northern Somalia. While these were mostly city-states controlling small territories, some sultanates became larger. Among them, the Sultanate of Ifat and Adal, often in struggle against the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia for the control of the trade routes who passed south of Zeila and into the heart of the African Horn. The Muslim kingdom of the Ifat, as you can see on this map to the left, Sultanate was situated along the trade route on the edge of the Rift Valley escarpment during a period of the 10th to the 16th century. And according to local traditions, the Islamic State of the Shoah was founded a little bit before, during the 9th century, and was absorbed by the Ifat in the 13th century. In the 15th century, the kingdom of Ifat fell under the control of the Sultanate of Adal. And the kingdom of Adal controlled the whole Afar plain from Suakin on the Red Sea up to the Showa and the Chirchir Mountains. So in April-May 2008, a team directed by François-Xavier Fauvel and Bertrand Hirsch carried out excavations on the Muslim site of Nora, located 20 kilometers to the northeast of the current town of Shoa Orbit, near the village of Wassiso. The site of Nora is located midway between the high plateau and the floodplain of the river Awash. As you can see here, it's really to the limit, between the plateau and the plain. It is a very difficult site to access, and only by foot or camel. Even 4x4 cannot access to the site. So we had to walk, but we camp on the top, on the mountain. So we camp directly near the site, on the site actually. The site was discovered in 2007 during some surveys to recognize the evidence of interto-medieval settlements known only by primary sources, so by the text. It was a renowned town which extended over several hectares. The elevation of many of the walls, in particular those of the Great Mosque, has been very well preserved, and the town also provided evidence of street networks and access route, town walls, necropolis compounds, and possibly hydraulic facilities. The site, as I said, was very well preserved with very good conservation conditions for the building, and it was easy for us, with our surveyor, to do a topographic map coverage of the whole site. This is a joke. We didn't have trees, so we didn't have shade. As an archaeologist specialist of Islamic architecture, I was in charge of the excavation of the Great Mosque and the study of the other mosque on the site. The Great Mosque of Nora is the main religious building of the town, located on the highest and central part of the site. You can see here it's M1, M4 mosque. The town of Nora had also 4 neighborhood or district mosques. The number of the neighborhood mosques is a good indicator to know how big the town was. With 5 mosques in Nora, it's a clear evidence that we are dealing with a settlement somewhere between a large village and a small city, a small town. The position of the mosque also raises the question of how the town was divided and whether it was based on administrative, religious, or ethnic criteria, as it is often the case in many Islamic cities in Sub-Saharan Africa. You can see here the neighborhood or the district mosque. The neighborhood mosque of Nora are square, measuring 6 meters side, and have a prayer room of an average surface of 20 square meters. A central column supports a roof made of perishable material. The very basic mihrab, the niche toward Mecca, is not surrounded by any special decoration, and the main entrance of the mosque is always located to the south, opposite the mihrab. In front of the mosque, there is always a small courtyard to the south with an ablution area located to the southeast of the courtyard. You can see here the plan of the Great Mosque and the district or neighborhood mosque, and the ablution area is, in fact, we identified the ablution area by these kind of round stones were used, to wash, the feet, of the people just before praying. The Great Mosque of Nora is homogeneous both in style and in its construction. The prayer room has a 43 square meter surface area, and the structure is almost a perfect square, 30 meters from the east, west, and 12 meters from north-south. This mosque is exceptionally well preserved. The main walls are preserved up to where the roof begins. The masonry of the mosque is made up of reddish brown and dark brown rhyolitic blocks. The size of the course varies, is around 20 centimeters, and these courses are quite irregular. The stones are bound together with an orange-brown earth-based mortar. The thickness of the main wall is between 80 to 90 centimeters. The angle of the mosque are coined with large stones cut in brown rhyolite, as you can see here and here. The mosque walls and columns set up directly on the bedrock. There are no real foundation walls. The main entrance of the mosque is located at the center of the facade and measures 1 meter 40 centimeter height, and between the wooden frame and the current floor level, 22 centimeter wide. But actually, we had to dig a little bit, so it's not the original, of course, floor and level here. You will see that later. Most of the elevation of the north wall of the Qibla or Qibla wall is preserved approximately 5 meters above the current ground. The wall measures 1.25 meters thick. In the center of the wall, the niche of the mihrab, as you can see here, is facing north toward Mecca. The ogival-shaped niche opening measures 2.27 centimeters, as from the level of the original floor, by 94 centimeters wide at the bottom and 76 centimeters at the starting point of the arch. The depth of the niche of the recess is around 1 meter, 96 centimeters, and the keystone, as you can see probably here, the keystone was cut in the shape of a T, and this monolithic element is characteristic of the mosque of this region. Two small quadrangular niches has been set into the both sides of the mihrab at a human face height. As you can see here, one niche here, and the other one was blocked later here. The northeast angle of the Qibla wall has been pierced with a door to access to a staircase, providing an access to the roof on the other side of the facade of the Qibla wall. You can see in the corner the door to access to the staircase leading to the rooftop, of the mosque. Of course, this staircase was used by the muezzin to call for the prayer call. The column of the mosque, all the columns disappeared, but we found, the bases of the columns, during our excavation. But only one column is still preserved, in elevation and in situ, as you can see here. Yes, the columns are made up of small triangular rhyolitic blocks of relatively uniform module, measuring 5 centimeters thick by 12 to 20 centimeters long for the base of the triangle that is exposed. The masonry is made up of irregular rubbles in the core of the support and triangular blocks only for the facing. These blocks, the blocks are laid in irregular courses and bonded together with the same brown orange clay mortar. And the only column preserved, as I told you, is this 5-meter high column. Here you can see the bases of the other columns. As always, because I excavated, as Binyam said, many mosques, in Kenya, Tanzania, Maldives, we started by a small test pit, just to check a little bit the stratigraphic potential of the building and the preservation of the building. So we started by a test pit in front of the mirrored niche, and then we extended, the excavations to the whole prayer room. Of course, not completely to the whole prayer room, because I know that we have a lot of conservation heritage architects with us. And because I work with these architects, I know that most of the time archaeologists are destroying buildings. But me, I take care when I excavate a building. So what we did, we let a little bit, of soil, around the walls to make sure that the building won't collapse. We extended the excavations to the whole prayer room to have an idea, of all the support and the stratigraphy and the history of this building. You can see here the diameter of the column and their layout in the room varies quite considerably, and I will come back on that later. But this, which indicates that the work was done more likely by builders and masons rather than architects. And of course, that during the medieval period, we cannot even talk about architects. We are talking about builders, we are talking about engineers, but we are not talking about architects, as the definition of today. Here you can see the excavations with, you can see that here one original floor appears, during the excavation. And according to stratigraphic dating evidence and radiocarbon dating, we can trace, the history of the Great Mosque of Nora, and the history of the Great Mosque of Nora can be divided into 4 main phases. Here, it's a bit complicated, but I will try to explain to you. We have here the, what we call stratigraphic diagram, and here you have the result of the C14 or radiocarbon dating, for all the main phases and layers. And you have here in light gray the main phases. So I will start by the first phase, the oldest one. But of course, in archaeology, we are digging from top to bottom. So we start by the latest to arrive to the oldest one. As I said to my students, because they are like me, they like food, it's like a cake, and to excavate, you have to remove all the layers. So let's start by the first one, actually, the oldest one. So the first phase dates back to from the beginning of the 13th century and presents a pre-Islamic level, which is characterized by post halls that I will show you later. The second phase corresponds to the first mosque built in the 14th century. The prayer room supports were made of columns with monolithic bases. The third phase is characterized by a second floor level and composite columns, the ones that you saw previously. The Nora Mosque, as we can see nowadays, and was probably built at the beginning of the 15th century. And the present-day mosque, I mean the ruins that you can see here today, in fact, we have a final stage that you can see. It's phase 4. It's when the mosque was reused between the 16th to the 17th century during the Christian domination of the region. And in fact, the people didn't have, after an earthquake, You can see destruction level ashes here. After an earthquake, the people had not enough maybe workload, support, money to reconstruct, to rebuild the mosque. And so they reuse the mosque as a kind of ziyara or open air prayer area, but they didn't rebuild the mosque. So the mosque that you can see today is a mosque from the 15th century, but actually by archaeological evidence, we can prove that the mosque was reused by people still living on the site between the 16th and 17th century. But it was a decline, it was the end of the site. Here you have a photo of the prayer room. You can see here the post hall. At the beginning, we were thinking that maybe it was the first mosque from the 13th century, but actually, because, one characteristic of the mosque is use of support, columns, pillars, in the prayer room. But you can see here, there is no really a real organization, in the plan, and it was most probably houses or granaries, So I don't have any archaeological evidence to tell you that the first building was a mosque. What I can tell you that the second building, the building from the 14th century, was a mosque, and you can see here one of the original pillars. Here you have some small foundations, with little blocks, and then you have this monolithic drum, here, or base, of a column. Actually, we don't know if it was a base for a wooden column or if it was a drum. And then all the columns were built, with this kind of drum. And here you have the columns from the 15th century, the ones that I described, previously with the red earth mortar. And here you have a plan. Actually, I don't know if the plan can help because it's a bit complicated, but you have the post hall from a previous building that I don't consider that it's an Islamic building or a mosque because I cannot see any organization. But the one with the drum, the monolithic columns, you can see that there is a clear pattern because you have 4 columns and these columns are quite well aligned, with the niche, of the mihrab and the main door. So we have a building here from the 14th century. And then the building was rebuilt, with these red columns, the composite columns. And here you have what I call an organization within the disorganization, and I will come back on that later about the builders, of the Great Mosque of Nora during the 15th century. So you have this, all these phases. Now I would like to put a little bit, the Mosque of Nora, Ethiopian mosque, in a regional context. And when I say regional context, it's not, a context linked to post-colonial borders and national borders. So I will talk about mosque in Ethiopia and mosque in Somalia. And I hope that I won't open a new conflict, between different countries. So, but actually, it's important to mention the fact that the history of Ethiopia, as I mentioned previously, was too long, divided, between Ethiopia and Christians and Somalia or Eritrea with Muslims. And when you look at the medieval past, of Ethiopia, it's much more complicated than that. And it was not also a conflictual history. It's what my colleagues, François-Xavier Fauvel and Bertrand Hirsch, developed. The idea that people, they were not always in war. They communicate through the trade routes, and they exchange, they had a lot of trade, between Christians and Muslims. So it was not always what it was described for the 16th century, And of course, this division, this conflict, between Christian and Muslims, they were supported by an European narrative, because that when the Portuguese, arrive in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, of course, they supported, Christians, against Muslims. So they supported, this kind of conflict and division. But actually, when you look at the history and the archaeology of the region, you can see that the people, they were more cooperative than that. And you can see that all these Muslim sites, they couldn't exist also without, collaboration, cooperation, and exchanges, cultural exchanges, but also economical exchanges with Christian lands and kingdoms. So the layout of columns in the Nora Mosque and the basic appearance of the masonry, the lack of care given to the treatment of the mihrab, are all elements that push us to rethink, the architectural influences of the high Ethiopian plateau between Christians and Muslims. And my first questions were, in fact, why there is such a technological difference between the mosque and the churches built in Ethiopia during the same period. The monolithic churches of Lalibela date back from the end of the 12th century, beginning of the 13th century. And according to oral tradition, they have been built maybe by refugees flying from Egypt, maybe linked to Coptic monks, So why this, and during the Fatimid period, and why this architecture, why the architecture of the Islamic towns situated in the high plateau of Ethiopia are so basic and so different compared to the churches built during the same era? So two possible answers can be put forward. Firstly, it's not only about a simple difference between Christians and Muslims. The people of Nora could come from different background, origin, and they could have brought with them different architectural traditions. Then the environmental constraints and with the ecology could have played a role, into account. The sandstone of the Lalibela Mountains is more easy to work with, than the hard rhyolite volcanic, stone from Nora. The rhyolite blocks split naturally into plaques, flat blocks that can be used to build walls, but it's also very difficult to cut, these plaques. It does appear also that the debitage techniques of these plaques, these blocks in Nora, are very similar to the one of other places in Africa, like, for example, the Great Zimbabwe, along the Rift Valley. And you have maybe a connection between the Rift Valley in Ethiopia until Zimbabwe. The blocks are separated from the natural bedrock by heat. So it was a technique that the people used to collect these blocks. The Mosque of Nora has very little in common with the mosque of the coast of the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. And I can tell you because I spent 20 years to work on the mosque in Kenya and Tanzania. All this takes us back to the diffusion of Islam in Ethiopia, roots recently revisited by Bertrand Hirsch and Xavier Faubel. By looking at the architectural influences, it seems that Islam arrived mainly by a route along the highlands from the north to the Red Sea via the eastern Tigray, and not by the Indian Ocean coast. Now, if we look at the Mosque of Nora, they are stylistically linked to the settlements on the plain borders, extending out towards Zela and Berbera. You can see here Zela, the port, and the actual port city and the state of Djibouti here. And this represents a simple and indigenous architecture with almost no exogenous influences. The simplicity of the technique used in the construction of these religious buildings is mainly due to the scarcity of readily available materials and the fact that they are difficult to use, as I mentioned previously. The Muslim geographers during the medieval period divided the coast into different regions. To the north, this area, the land of the Berber, Bilad el-Barbar. Then came the land of the Janj, that we call now Bilad el-Janj, that we call now the Swahili coast, Nora depended mainly on contact with Zela and Berbera and the settlements along the roads. The mosques of that area are culturally linked and religiously interconnected. Thanks to our archaeological mission in Nora and to the study of the listed sites, it's possible to identify a style of mosque that could be called the Adal style from the Sultanate of Adal and the Mosque of the Bilad el-Berber. These mosques are characterized by dry stone masonry bonded together with an earth-based mortar with a very basic mihrab and a staircase minaret with no tower. It's just you have to access to the roof for the call of the prayer, but you don't have minaret. The supports inside the mosque, the prayer room, are not standardized, and the spine alignment is not followed. The main entrance to the prayer room is located to the south. The ablution area are situated to the southeast. This type of mosque can be found all along the old trade routes linking the High Ethiopian plateau to the Gulf of Aden or over an area of the size of the Adal Kingdom. Here you have the location of Nora, and you have the location of the site of Abbassa. You can see here the Mosque of Abbassa. And in the northwest present-day Somalia. And Abbassa was maybe the capital of the Emirate of Adal in the Ifat Kingdom. And the Great Mosque of Abbassa measures 18 to 16 meters. The prayer room comprises 12 cruciform T-shaped pillars and columns. You can see that there is a mixity of shapes in the pillars, and also in the, at least it's regular. It's not like in Nora, but you can see it's regular, but you have some, there is some problems when you look at the space, you know, there is no symmetry, the symmetry that you can see in some mosques in the rest of the Muslim world. You have also the niches, you know, around the niche of the minbar and the staircase minarets. And the ceramics collected on this site, the site is dated from the 14th to the 15th century, so contemporary of Nora site. So thanks to our research, it was possible to identify a style of mosque that we call the Adal style, or the Mosque of the Bilad al-Barbar. These mosques are characterized by dry stone masonry bonded together with an earth-based mortar with a very basic mihrab and a staircase minaret. This type of mosque can be found all along the old trade routes linking the High Ethiopian plateau to the Gulf of Aden, as I said, and roughly the size of Adal Kingdom. The Nora Mosque are stylistically linked to the settlement of the plain, extending out towards Zeyla and Berbera. The local architecture received very little external influences, except maybe some influences from the Nile Valley and the Nubian Kingdom, but actually it was very difficult to trace. It will be too long to go in details, you know, for this 30-minute presentation. And actually, it's a good introduction. If you wish to know more about mosque in Sub-Saharan Africa, including Somalia and Ethiopia, I invite you to look at my book. Will be published, is under press, will be published this summer by Brill, about historic mosques in Sub-Saharan Africa. It's not only about Ethiopia, it's also about West Africa, up to Madagascar, actually, to East Africa. And if you wish also to have a look at an exhibition, a virtual exhibition that we organize with my colleague from the Zamani project, Cape Town University in South Africa, a project, a response, a scholarly response to Black Lives Matter. Black Monuments Matter is an exhibition that we have at the Aga Khan Center until the end of the month. So you still have 2 weeks to visit the website. And I have also a short course on mosque in Sub-Saharan Africa, organized by the Aga Khan University. I think it's in May or in June, so you still have the time to register if you wish. So I think you have few events and publications if you want to go in depth, you know, about Ethiopian mosque and not only. And to end this short presentation, I would like to thank first the people from Shoah Robit for their hospitality, their food, and our workers. And of course, I would like to thank the directors of the mission, François-Xavier Fauvel and Bertrand Hirsch, for their trust and support. And finally, I would like to thank the colleagues who assisted me during the excavation and documentation of the Great Mosque, especially Chloé Capel, postdoc in Islamic Archaeology, and Olivier Onésim, surveyor. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Stephane, for such a great presentation. It was very eye-opening. Definitely, I was not expecting this, for sure. Biniam and Juliet, I think your mics are still muted, but yeah, so thank you. That was really eye-opening. Everyone, you can type in your questions in the chat box, both on Facebook and on Zoom. But in the meanwhile, I have a few questions from the Interval team that I would go ahead and ask you. The first is that, given the claim that the architecture of Nora has little to zero external influence, how has the discovered, and I'm quoting you here, evidence of street network, access routes, town walls, and possible hydraulic faucets evolved there? Was it just by themselves, or did they bring it from where they came from originally, or?
Okay, it's a good question. Actually, okay, because you know, when I joined this project, as I said, I had my own excavations, but this project I joined as a specialist of Islamic architecture. So basically, I joined the project only to excavate the Great Mosque and to study the neighborhood mosque. So most probably, my colleague François Xavier, and Bertrand, they would be the best, you know, to answer to your question. But because I spent more than 1 month, you know, there, I can also answer to your question. The site is well preserved, so it is possible to see the streets, you know, the houses and so on. And when I said no influences, actually, it is because, you know, as archaeologist or art historian, you always try to trace, you know, influences, cultural influences, to see the connection, you know, cultural connections between people. So when I say no connections, it's in fact because you cannot trace parallel of this Ethiopian mosque with mosque in the rest of the Muslim world, okay? But actually you can trace parallel, regional parallels. So it's what I try to do in the last part of my talk, to trace parallel between Ethiopia and Somalia. And to say, look, it's we have to look at this mosque not from a modern perspective, a contemporary perspective, but from a perspective from the medieval past, you see. And so you have influences, but these influences, they are more like regional influences than, if I can say that, international influences. Actually, and for your question about urbanism, it's a very interesting question, because you can see in Nora, you can see the streets, you can see the houses, you can see the compounds, you can imagine, you know, families, how they live and so on. So a lot of work is ongoing. I mentioned the project directed by my colleague, you know, Julien Loiseau. And I think it's a fantastic project because they continue to excavate, you know, sites, you know, like that, you know, in the area. And it's a multidisciplinary project. With Ethiopian, Europeans, it's really international, North Americans and so on. And so it's interesting to see that they study also the urbanism. But urbanism, it's a big and complicated question, because I did a lot of urban studies, you know, for the Swahili sites. And it's a big question in Sub-Saharan Africa, because the definition that we have of the villages, towns and cities, they are mainly based on European definitions, you know, and from time to time they don't apply, you know, to Sub-Saharan African context. And so it's interesting to revisit, you know, the idea of urbanism, you know, and what is a village, what is a city, and we have to put always things in context. So I would say that what is interesting is that in Nora you have a complex urbanism, because you have streets, you have neighborhood mosques, you have probably some maybe public buildings also. So it's very interesting. And I was also surprised, you know, I would say, when I visited, you know, over Ethiopian sites, like for example, Lalibela, that unfortunately in Ethiopia right now, people are still focusing on the main buildings, like the churches. And we know very little about the people who build these churches or live around these churches. So basically, my dream as an archaeologist is to see more studies about the old Lalibela, you know, and more studies about not the architecture that you can see, but the architecture and the urbanism of ancient Ethiopian, you know, and the medieval past. Because actually, when you look at that, we don't have enough researchers, you know, about. So it's difficult to answer to your question, because I do not have any information about the history of urbanism in Ethiopia, and I don't know if such a book or studies exist actually.
Okay. So next question is from Deborah. The question is, can it be established from the excavation of the 13th century site at Nora that it had been abandoned before the construction of the 14th century mosque?
Okay, yes. It's interesting because archaeologists, we have a way of thinking, and after this presentation, you will probably all think that the archaeologists are very stupid, but we are based on evidence and interpretation. So as I always say, be careful, never believe an archaeologist. But nevertheless, I try to follow, some methodology, and especially methodology, based, methodologies that we use in all serious excavations, and what we do, we rely on evidences. So what I show you is, a stratigraphic section, with the main layers. And what is interesting, I mentioned the fact that at one point the city of Nora was destroyed by an earthquake. And it's very interesting because we have a very thick layer of ashes. I won't compare, Nora with Pompeii, in Italy, but actually it is very true that we have this layer of ash. So we know that the city was destroyed. And I mentioned that the city was reused and reoccupied later, but it was after, it was only by few people. And to come back to your question, Deborah, the fact that we don't know actually if from time to time with the archaeologists, we say abandon, destroy, but the reality is more complicated than that. I explain to you. For religious sites like mosque, this site, you cannot build a house on a mosque because it's a sacred land. It's for the Muslims, it's important. So most of the time, people build mosque over mosque. It's the reason why we found two mosques. It's because the first mosque was probably destroyed. But when I say destroyed, it was the mosque was upgraded, if you wish. So basically, to build a new mosque, the people they have to dismantle the first mosque. So when we say, or when I said abandon, it's more for the layer after, the earthquake and the ashes. And between the 13th and the 14th century, we cannot say really that the site was abandoned. I would even say that you have a continuity in the site. From the 15th, you have a continuity all over the life of the site, from the 13th to the 17th century. But we have this big layer of ashes and the earthquake. So we know that at one point the site was in a bad shape, if I may say that. So we have layers, but it's not because we have a change that the site was or the mosque was abandoned.
Okay, so next question is still from Entitled team. It's that you said there are two levels, the modern and the medieval levels, right? In the medieval level being in the third phase, the 15th century, and the modern being the fourth phase, the 16th and the 7th century. But there is a huge architectural gap between the two. The third is more rectangular, while the fourth phase is more circular and more disorganized, as you mentioned in your article. So what can cause such a huge gap between architectural styles in just 2 centuries?
Okay, yes, and I think, if I may correct you, Mina, I think that because with what you say, the fourth phase is the first phase. So basically, it's disorganized because with the post hall. And the first phase, in fact, is disorganized because I don't believe actually that it was a mosque. Because you can see all these post halls, they are all over the place. And you cannot see, kind of row of columns or pillars and so on. So at the very beginning, I was thinking, oh, maybe we have a mosque there. But then we don't have any evidence, to prove that the first building, the first phase, was a mosque. So, and I think if it is related to the question of your colleague, the participant, I think that this disorganization of the first phase maybe proves that we have maybe one or two structures, maybe a hut, a house with a granary next to it. So it's very difficult to interpret it, the first phase. We know that we have a first phase. We don't know if it is an Islamic phase. We don't know if it was a mosque or even a religious building. It could have also been a religious building, a pre-Islamic religious building. Because, when you look at the history of mosque, and actually all the religious buildings, they are always built on top of the others. So basically, in England or in France, you will have a church built on the top of a Celtic, a pagan temple. In the Middle East, mosque will be built, over a Roman or Byzantine temple. So you have always this kind of permanence, of the religious architecture. So maybe the first post halls, they belong to a religious building, animist building, or let's say non-Christian or non-Muslim building. But we cannot say anything about the first phase.
Got it. Another question from Telma. What is the connection between the local people and these archaeological sites? Or what is the impact of meaning of these places nowadays in the local society?
It's a good question. Actually, okay, because my main specialty is Swahili Coast, I work a lot on this topic in Kilwa in south of Tanzania about the fact that people, they reuse, the building, and I will come back on that later. For Nora, the problem is I spent only 1 month, and it was in 2008. So you have to forgive me that my memories are not so good. And but of course, what I remember from the people living in the village, below the site, because now the village is quite far. You have to walk, as I said, with camels and so on. But the people, they still respect the place. So this place is a respected place. The people, they can, but they don't, but they can pray if they are, because they are Muslims, they can pray, in the mosque. So they have a respect for the site. Now, from what I saw about ruins and mosques in Sub-Saharan Africa, so not only in Ethiopia, but also in East Africa, is you have also stories connected to ruins. So people are also afraid of the ruins. They are afraid because they believe that spirits, ghosts, bad spirits, shitan, shitani, they live in the area. And so they are very, very, very afraid about these kind of things. And I have, because I'm very talkative, I have a story about that. In Tanzania, my architect colleagues, he was smoking, on the site at night. And the people, they didn't know that it was the architect. And they said, oh, we have seen a shitan, at night in the ruins, but it was just a French architect. So just to tell you that people really believe they believe in the sacred, in the power, of these ruins, and they respect, very much these places.
Okay. The last question is from Mario. It says, what was the impact of Imam Ahmed B. Ibrahim's war in this archaeological site, any remains of that conflict?
Well, actually, it is true when you talk about Ahmed, Ahmed Gan, the fact that the 16th century, it's already a kind of layer of stories above the stories that we wanted to discover or to uncover. The fact that we work on the site, and on the site with prior to this so-called jihad, And so the impact is absolutely non-existent, because if you have seen, after the earthquake and the layer of ashes that we found on the site, people, they lived on the site, but it was like a semi-abandoned village. So basically, during this jihad, during the 16th century, the site of Nora was already in ruins. So basically, I cannot see, as an archaeologist or an historian, any impact or any relationship between these events from the 16th century and the site of Nora. Because the site of Nora, if you look at what we found, the apogee, I don't like to say that, but all the people, they understand. If I talk about the golden age, or the apogee of the site, is from the 13th to the 15th century.
Oh, got it. Lastly, I have a question of your opinion. It's on the availability of materials. You say that it played a huge factor in the identity of the mosque in that area. So availability-wise, in relation to the other mosque, namely the what was the name? Hold on, the Asbury Mosque. If the Nora town had those materials that the other mosque had, what kind of development would they have had?
Okay, good question. Again, Asbury Mosque actually was excavated by my colleague Bertrand Poissonnier and Bertrand Hirsch and Derese. Actually, Asbury Mosque is very similar to Nora. And the people, they use the mosque and so on. So you have two mosques that they excavated. The style with the stone, the masonry is very similar. But in between your question, I would like to mention the fact that there is still a kind of mystery. You have this phase, from the 14th century where the people, they use this drum, this well-cut, columns. So we have a phase where the people, they really took care about the architecture, and they spend some time, to cut, the rhyolite, and to have this beautiful drum, cut. So to me, as an archaeologist, the question would be more about this period. Why the people, they had this technology to cut these nice drums, and then suddenly they jump to this not easy, but easier way of building, the mosque. So there is a kind of mystery that I would like to solve, to see a solution.
Yeah. So I think that's it for the questions. Stephane, thank you again for this amazing presentation and introducing us to this whole new architectural style that I personally had no idea about. And also thank you everyone for attending this talk. It really means a lot. We have our next talk on April by Brooke Tefera on restoration project, a couple of them. So we do hope to see you there for that. And also make sure to register for that. You can find the link in our social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Just search for Intibau Ethiopia. Also, if you can keep up with the main Intibau page, you'll find more details about that. And to become a member, I'll share the link again. To become a member of Intibau in general, just sign up to the link I made public to the chat. And yeah, thank you everyone. And Jules, thank you for helping with this as well. And Stephane, thank you again very much. So have a good.
Thank you, Stephane. Have a good rest of the day, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you everyone for attending.
Good evening.
Thank you, Stephane.